Hello there, everybody. This is Why Documentation Matters. In case you were confused about what session you were in, this is also Bad Camp 2018, in case you were confused about what camp/year it was. All right, my name is Mike Nielsen. I am a senior web developer at Red Hat. I've been working with Drupal since 2008, 2009. For those wondering what version that was, my first Drupal module was for a Drupal 4 site. So way back in the day. Views wasn't even a thing yet. You can imagine that. So I live up in Portland. I've worked for a variety of companies. Two that some people may have heard of were Open Sourcery and Phase 2. Both of which were in the Portland office. Like I said before, working since 2008. I live in Portland, Oregon, with my family and my Irish setter Molly, who, like Monty Python, is not featured in this slideshow. All right. So now I've talked about me. Let's talk about you. Let's get a quick poll of the room, just from a quick show of hands. Whose role in an organization maps closely to developer? Excellent. Go devs. Project manager. All right, cool. So we've got some excellent. These are some of the people I want to talk to on some of this stuff. How about like architects? Okay, kind of. What about, let's say, like product owners and what do we want to put in for our? What else is in there? Product owner, marketing manager, no C-suite folks. All right, cool. The suits are gone, so we can talk about whatever we want behind our back. All right, so got about an even split, sounds like, of developers and project managers. So I've got, in my presentation, I'm going to have some just kind of photos. This one is in particular is the Harvard computers, part of the. They worked under a gentleman named Edward Charles Pickering. They were some of the original astrophysicists. And so this lovely lady in the is Annie Jump Cannon. She's one of the original astrophysicists, basically, in the U.S. She got an honorary doctorate from Oxford, among others. She actually. We talk about stars. I'm kind of an astronomy enthusiast. She's actually one of the first people to design the system wherein we categorize stars by their visible spectra. And she was also not only was she a woman and an astronomer in a year when neither of those were when that combination was really unheard of. She also she'd lost her hearing, so she also had a very visible disability. So, one thing that we all have in common, PM, dev, architect, we're all users. We all use software. And software is more and more part of our lives. And as such, how we get to know that software, how we introduce ourselves, and also how we introduce others to that software is kind of the crux of where I want to get to on this. Let's get started. So what we're going to cover is why documentation is hard, how to argue expanding time spent creating said documentation, and then how to make documentation fun. This is a circus bad camp. We're going to have some fun here on what makes good documentation, and then also what makes bad documentation. So this is kind of a best practices and design patterns for documentation, and then also some anti-patterns, things that happen that I've run into in my experiences that I have found frustrating, to put it lightly. So again, as a speaker, I'm going to reiterate now that we've got everybody here. I don't mind questions or instant feedback. If I'm not clear on something, it's my job to make it clear. So please feel free to call, interrupt. We can pause on this. I've got plenty of time. We have 45 minutes, and we've got some ground to cover. But in fact, I encourage you to interrupt me. So I'm hoping to learn from your experiences as you are to learn from mine. So let's go ahead and start it. Why documentation? I'm passionate about documentation because for me it's the first direct contact that most anyone has with the projects that we create. So it's kind of the hello, how are you? When you first move into a neighborhood, if it's a good one, usually your neighbors come in with like a plate of cookies or a pie. So documentation is kind of the first steps that anyone takes when they get to know a code base or a project that you're working on. And so this is a unique opportunity to kind of make a good first impression and get people up and running on that. And here's a caveat. I'm no master documentarian. Like all developers, I run out of time. I under-document things, or I miss something crucial. So this is just, again, my experiences, things that I've learned. All right. So if you're on Twitter, Code Wisdom is a great account to follow, or at least list. Documentation, Damian Conway documentation is a love letter you write to your future self. Fun fact about that, the avatar on there, I don't know if you can see it, but that's a picture of Rear Admiral Grace Hopper. She's a Navy Rear Admiral, one of the few female. She was one of the original creators of the COBOL language. Before COBOL, there was Fortran, and before Fortran, there was darkness on the land. She also coined the term computer bug. The story is that there was a moth that flew in some relays. This is literally how old we're talking about. Computers had literal physical electrical relays, and a moth flew into one of them, and so she coined the term computer bug. So that's Rear Admiral Grace Hopper. All right. So we write documentation. One of the things why I write documentation is I want to relearn something, or I want to learn something. Documenting a fix creates something called retroactive learning, and retroactive learning is defined as an educational theory wherein someone uses episodic memory to create connections that were not originally there in the original experience. So by sort of reliving an experience, you can re-encode memory and relearn lessons from that. So creating docs provides users with the opportunity to step through the creation process of the solution, which is now in the past, but now being the present, can yield new understanding for the producer. And codifying these breakthroughs in the documentation will also allow others to continue that process of improvement and discovery. Also, being stuck sucks, and getting unstuck feels amazing. And that's all I'm really going to say about it, other than I find this Oprah gift slightly unnerving. Yeah. Which probably fits with the circus theme as well.
So that's not anything.
So, another reason, so besides just writing documentation to serve as a mnemonic device that I can learn and remember things, both past and future self, you also write documentation for other people. The other half of the equation is the people who aren't the writer of the documentation that will consume that. That allows the people who use the docs to go further faster. So it's good for it. Documentation is good for a team because it ensures future development follows the same patterns created by the people who laid down that coding pattern and documents. More billable hours. Okay, hear me out. It can be considered an easy win on the project. Take a little bit of extra time on a task and write some early stage docs, just kind of as a first pass on. Okay, what is this thing that we just built? That could potentially be a little extra hours on that, which you could very easily make the case for later that, a little more time, spending some time on some documentation, a little more billable hours. Everybody wins. Also, better documentation and more documentation means there are fewer meetings on this, random trivial error that, is easy to resolve from a 5-minute read of a README versus like a 25-minute of, okay, can you hear me now? Okay, I'm sharing my screen. Can you see it? Kind of back and forth with video conferencing that so often happens. Before you know it, you waste 35 minutes and away you still haven't figured out the problem, or maybe you have, but still, it's a 45-minute versus a 5-minute solution. All right, again, mind states, this is kind of freezing the creator, the engineer, the developer's mind state at the time of the creation of this particular piece of code, kind of getting them into that, helping continue on that process. So a little bit of a war story. The last two will be, one time I spent the better part of an hour debugging a deadlocked database on a PHP unit test run, and I was so frustrated. I was really peeved because it was early on in the project, and just randomly reached out on Slack with my engineering team, and I said, oh, by the way, you should probably just go, someone even just kind of flippantly offhand mentioned, oh, just go see the wiki page on PHP unit tests. So I went there grumbling because I read the top half of the page, and it turns out that below the fold was the exact problem I was having verbatim, and a 2-line fix, a drush command that fixed the problem, and I was off to the races again. So at that point I realized, maybe I should, so I bookmarked the index to that page and basically went through and decided to spend 20 minutes a day just kind of like looking through the index and seeing which I was comfortable with, which pieces I was comfortable with and which I wasn't. So big shout out to Derek for that. That was his bug he found, and he put it in the docs. And now, anytime anyone says, "Oh, I've got a deadlock DB on the PHP," and everyone goes, "Wiki, go to the wiki." All right. So to wrap up this section, documentation is good for ourselves. It creates mnemonics, which help people remember. It helps others to get up to speed and over issues faster, and it's good for the community. A little sneak peek of future coming attractions. We'll have more on that later. All right, so let's talk about why documentation is hard. If documentation is so beneficial, but it's so infrequent and so poorly done, why is that? For starters, documentation is hard to find. It can be opaque and it can be out of date. When someone has spent the time to create the documentation, then consigns that beautiful content to some hinterland where no one will ever appreciate it, that's a tragedy. Documentation needs to be clear. Not everyone in an organization has a computer science background. We've run into that where we talked about singletons. It's a design system. It's a design pattern jargon that if you don't have a steady computer science thing, you're like, what is that? Is it a module? Is it it's something beyond that. Last one, documentation is one commit away from being deprecated. So it's extremely important to have regular reviews to ensure that there are no references to the system that no longer exist. All right. This quote from Wired Ferret from DevOps days. I could probably just have put this one slide up for that whole section on why documentation is hard and walked away. In fact, this is about 2/3 of the problems I've had with documentation as an engineer. Excuse me. So it says documentation is a gray area. Engineers generally don't get promoted for writing, and they don't get fired if they don't. No one wants to blow up their story's estimate because they get lost on a rabbit hole writing documentation, and especially not stakeholders and people with a financial interest. It's problematic because we don't make writing documentation an engineering must-have. We talk a lot more about mentorship and other senior level bona fides about how to become a senior dev. Documentation never somehow makes it onto that list. My hope is that today we can kind of, as a group, kind of disperse into our organization to kind of start to change that culturally within the organization. Just kind of make a case for, hey, you want to be a senior, write some good docs, get in there, and help onboard people better. All right. Writing code is not documentation. Journalism and writing and novel writing both involve lots of research and construction of narratives, but no one ever says Christopher Moore and Maggie Haberman are the same person. These are they're vastly different skill sets, and just because one is super proficient at writing code does not mean you're going to be like the world's best documenter. All right. This is another quote. This is from Brad Frost, designer of the Pattern Lab. He also wrote a book called Atomic Design, and I would highly recommend it. He is He's really, really awesome at what he does, and a lot of big Drupal companies are actually building off of his work, and it's nice. It's really neat to see where his thought processes are. And he talks about that makers aren't users, and so a lot of times we, as a developer, as an engineer, we can't put ourselves, we don't automatically put ourselves in the frame of mind of a user. All right, reading is not understanding, and understanding is the ultimate goal for a lot of our projects. We need to get to there. In order to help others understand, we have to put ourselves in their mind space. Understanding where someone's coming from is commonly referred to as empathy. We're going to touch on a lot, being able to empathize is being able to put yourself in their shoes, to think how they would think and to see how they would see. All right. So quick rhetorical exercise. We're only going to take like 30 seconds. And just real quick, just imagine, if you've taken notes or whatever, try to write an algorithm or a set of instructions wherein you instruct a 4-year-old in the fine art of paper airplane making. I have first-hand experiences. I have first-hand experiences actually in both of these. But just kind of think for a second and spend a moment to about those. All right, pretty hard, huh? I mean, just to think about the process of going through that. In fact, I had to, for the latter one, I've had to watch a YouTube video at least a dozen times to get to that point. But now that it's muscle memory, I can do it. And so, just like this, languages have limitations. English has been around since the 7th century, no big deal, and yet somehow we still manage to fail on some of these things. How old's the web again? I mean, like 20, 30 years? I mean, so to think that as computer programmers, with less than a century's worth of development on our side, that we have language that is completely, free of error and whatever, it's tricky. This is one from, we don't know what we don't know. This is a picture of former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. He had a quote, says he said, there are things that we know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we don't know, which is really complicated. And the better, to put it more succinctly, there's the term outside context problem. And this is actually an excellent quote from Ian M. Banks. And it says, I'll go ahead and summarize that. So, sort of thing most civilizations encounter just once. They encounter rather in the same way as in a sentence encountered a full stop. For those not familiar with Ian Banks, if you're a fan of SpaceX, you're definitely familiar with his output. The robot drone ships, Of Course I Still Love You, and Just Read the Instructions were characters from Mr. Banks's seminal work on sci-fi. So, another fun book to read in your own time. So, so translating requirements. Think about this game of logical telephone. We use human language to explain concepts and requirements to deliver a particular feature or piece of code. Developers then, translate that. Linguistics and computer programming kind of come pretty close together in a lot of ways. We're translating English and design concepts into computer code, things that, and in a way that the computer can understand it and execute that. And then we want to turn around and take that computer behavior and then translate it back into English. What we get is a game of telephone here, and it's a small one that there are drop packets, and there's drops in understanding. So it's not a huge deal. This is not just a software problem. Education deals with learning and knowledge transfer. Going even further on, there's a whole subfield of philosophy called epistemology that talks about the foundation of how we know things, which that's like galaxy brain stuff right there. In fact, there's an unsolved philosophical problem called the Gettier problem, and it's basically how do we prove that when you justify a belief in something, that actually transfers into what we call knowledge. So, like I said before, education, philosophy, like these kind of knowledge transfer problems, they're not just, they're not just GitHub issues. They're not just ones that we have on our on a project that we're working on. They're, it's part of the human condition, I would argue. All right. Written communication is inadequate to express concepts like car crashes. There was an example of a court case where lawyers spent the better part of a day trying to explain a car crash using verbal language, until one of the jurors came out, actually went to the intersection, drew a map, went back to the jury room and showed everyone. In about 20 minutes, they all came to a consensus about what was going on there. So sometimes it's important to break out of just the written word. So, we have a lot of advantages in code. Our languages are simpler. Our concepts are not as nuanced. We don't have to explain emotions yet to, via PHP. Thankfully. So, fun. Another. This is Ida Rhodes. She was a programmer of the UNIVAC 1 machines, and she worked on computer translations of Russian, which has an amusing story about machine translations of languages and how computers don't have semantic, at least at the time they didn't have a semantic idea, so they were literally translating things and got confused. She also taught computer coding to people with disabilities, so she's another one of my heroes and someone I wanted to kind of give a shout out to in this talk. Now that we've covered why it's not easy to create documentation, let's go ahead and talk about convincing others to expanding our current stock of documentation as our project is necessary. So this is important to convince your manager, because really two things are: we shouldn't be writing docs in your own time. If it's in the company's best interests, the company should be compensating you for that. And secondly, you don't want to go rogue on a project and just write a whole bunch of documentation and spend a whole bunch of time and then get reprimanded. No one wants to be reprimanded for doing something their managers didn't approve previously. So it's easy. So one of the ways to do that, to ensure success, is to think of this on a long-term perspective, as a long-term shift towards creating more documentation and towards maintaining documentation. So here's some rubrics for like things that are, indicators that this particular campaign might be a good idea, or things that might be a bad idea, like that Animaniacs clip show. All right, so let's talk about the bus plan. This is the one that everyone uses. What happens if so-and-so gets, crossing the street on the way to work and gets hit by a bus? So they're gone, and what's to become of the project now? The pros of this: it's extremely visceral. It's simple. It's easy to communicate to management. You could just be like, hey, that guy, the one that everyone loves and everyone depends on, what if he's gone? And it's also pretty easily mockable, such as when like the lead developer has a family emergency, or name gets strep throat. They can drop off real quick, and all of a sudden it becomes very real to management about what the bus plan is. The downsides are definitely multiple. It's pretty much a one-time use only. Every time you use it from there on, it gets less. It's kind of I said before, management by crisis. So again, it uses fear, uses emotional manipulation to kind of invoke that kind of panic, and then you're almost back at square one, and then over multiple uses it loses its effectiveness. All right, so for everybody, quick show of hands. On the average, on a project, what's the average time to your first commit? We've got 6 hours, 12 hours, 32, and 60. So 6 hours. Okay. 12 hours. 32 hours. Okay, so we're definitely, and 60 hours. Okay, so we're definitely dying off in like the AB. I saw about 50% of the people who raised their hands did it in the first two, which is great. I've kind of done it in like the first, 12 to 36 hours or 32 hours, usually in the 20s. So depending on the maturity in the team, for other communities, especially like a Ruby or a JavaScript, most places expect a commit on the first day, most of the time before lunch. And in fact, a lot of them talk about, here's the crazy one, a lot of them talk about having code that you've written in your first day of work on production by the end of your first day. Imagine that. Yeah, it's lunacy. It's lunacy in the Drupal community. But in a lot of places, it's like, yeah, you get right in, you commit, and they start. You basically your onboarding is get something onto prod today, and so, all right, save money. So this is a purely financial argument. It's effective, but it's kind of dicey, mostly because you can't draw a direct through line from improving your documentation to better development outcomes directly, like the same way you can with marketing. So. It has a tendency to fall down over long term, especially if you can't, if there's a lapse in execution. All right. If this is a community project, a lot of times having better documentation is a hallmark of a bigger, more established project. So this is an easy way for smaller projects to kind of puff themselves, to make themselves look bigger, to make themselves look, more mature, more advanced. So you have a more mature community, and also it's more welcoming to users. It's good thinking about getting folks up and running on the project, which makes it kind of like a big giant welcome mat. Good early docs means that folks looking to contribute get started faster and feel more valued, which is a leading indicator of them sticking around, especially after things start to get a little tough, after the initial drop off, if they're having issues. Another great one. It also means that they're going to rep it to their friends. So when they're at coffee with their associates, and they're like, "Oh, hey, what are you working on now?" Or "What are you interested in?" He's like, "Oh man, I just got in on this new framework, and it's really great, and the docs are really fun, and like I really love it's been a great experience." And so they rep it to their friends. You've already got allies. All right. So this is a more sustainable variant on a way to save money. Training teams or onboarding is a huge productivity hit, and so having docs lowering your training cost is a great way to make that argument. All right, let's make documentation fun. So writing documentation is my happy place because I get to stretch my creative writing muscles. Which is usually reserved for email or Slack responses. So it's kind of a way for me to codify those and exercise that kind of right brain section. So there's basically the slides are going to break it down into either how make documentation fun to consume or fun to create. All right. Here's a crazy idea. What if you had an entire sprint, 2 whole weeks or 1 whole week, and you did nothing, you did no code whatsoever? Nothing but write documentation the entire time. How much documentation, how much cruft could you get out of the documentation in an entire sprint? You'd be done. You'd be golden. I mean, a lot of places, especially with larger teams, you could do you could clean out an entire documentation and update everything in 1 sprint. Think about that would look like. Imagine it. So. The idea would be, product owners can write docs just as easily as UI. Write documentation on how a UI works compared to a front-end dev or a designer. PMs could edit and plan the scope of the documentation. Designers could install the development environment and run through the first steps to kind of see how easy it is to onboard people. These are all people's secondary strengths. Everybody's team has secondary abilities. And a documentation sprint could use all of these. So, if you've got an on-site, lost the monitor for a second there. If you've got an on-site, you could take 60 minutes and do it like a mini sprint. Take 30 minutes to write, take 10 minutes to mingle, 10 minutes to revise, and 10 minutes to lock in and get everything ready. You spent an hour and you've gotten better docs out of it. You've got a whole week on-site. Why not have 2 sessions? You can knock out a fair bit more. These are, go for broke. You can create more docs in an afternoon than you do all year. Going back to how to make it easier to write or to consume documentation, add paragraph breaks, so like a vacation for your eyes. All right, add Flash, and not the Macromedia kind. No. The easiest way to keep someone from going stir crazy is to amuse them. Images and GIFs and emojis. A lot of companies aren't opposed, especially on internal documentation, to add a little bit of humor, levity. Adding photos, adding screenshots is easy. So I actually had to look up how to do screenshots in a Windows environment because it's been about 4 years since I've touched a Windows machine. But every desktop OS already comes installed with a way to capture screenshots. So much so that I actually had to go back and realize because I've got muscle memory for taking screenshots. So it just does a little like, boop. You get a little crosshair. Not gonna take it, and then it captures it, drops it on your desktop. It also, if you have Dropbox, it auto copies the link to Dropbox into your clipboard, so you can just drop that into wherever. So, screenshot is for Linux, and I think Shift Windows S does it for Windows. So, creating screenshots is simply there's no extra work. If you've got a computer, you can do it. All right. Tools for going multimedia, for making GIFs to capture, interactivity. There's something called Licecap, which is the most unfortunate sounding name, but it's the best. It's an amazing program. It's available for Mac OS and Linux, I believe, and it just pops up a little tiny box, and you just put it around your elements you want to capture, and you go, and you do stuff inside of the screen, and then you stop, and then it creates a GIF, and everything's awesome. If you need to add audio, you can do QuickTime for OS X. There's other places to capture screen and audio. It's more illustrative than a paragraph, and it's easier than a set of screenshots. So why not? This is an example of me playing around with GraphQL on the demo site, and I was really excited because I noticed, oh look, hey, cool, it did all these things, and that lives and it loops. And you could drop this GIF anywhere in your documentation, and it just loops and it just shows you what's going on. The click and the changing of the variable and the result, and it just does that automatically. Isn't that awesome? All right, let's talk about how to make documentation good. A backlog is a kind of a low impact way to get into a documentation sprint. You just start creating documentation stories. You talk about you break your project into chunks, and you just say, hey, we're going to start documenting this chunk here, and you put it in the backlog. You assign people to it, and they write the docs. This is almost like a doc sprint, but it's broken up and it's kind of piecemeal, slowly over time. And you treat the story as you would any other. You do QA, you do revisions, and you ship it, and then you iterate over that. Another one, create an index. I like to joke, RTFM is really hard when you don't know where the F, the M is. If you're unfamiliar with that acronym, I would look it up on Urban Dictionary because it is definitely NSFW. So yeah, automate it. If you can't make it exhaustive, get others to do that. Again, Derek created a developer index, wherein I've added a half a dozen pages on links to there because I was just paste, internal paste bins and things of that nature. And now everyone in the team knows where they are. And I have non-technical folks edit. Non-technical folks spot super computer sciencey jargon in less time than I can possibly think about. They also have familiarity with the why and the how. So they can definitely help out with that. So another way to do it is create a task template to document the logic. So if you have a task template when you're creating new stories, add a documentation step to the task template. This is kind of a little smaller, a little slower. Definitely want to get a little more buy-in. And if you can't document it, at the very least add a to-do and say, hey, I'm going to document this, or I want to document this, or it should be documented. All right. So encourage new hires to contribute to the docs. They'll be reading the docs, hopefully as part of their onboarding. But also encourage them, hey, they were coming at this with a lot of expertise and a lot of built-in knowledge. We might skip steps. So if we skipped a step and you think that's and it's something that's crucial, drop it in the docs. Let us know. Note tricky spots and hangups, and definitely check in on that, and encourage people to, as they're onboarding, to improve their own onboarding documentation. All right, Heracleitos of Greece said that everything changes and nothing stands still, or the only constant is change in the modern parlance. We need to revise documentation. Once you don't just finish documentation and dust our hands and walk off. Again, it can be invalidated with a single commit, as little as one of that. So definitely, check it out, revise it, get better. All right. So, mind the gap. Grizzled devs may know. So, for everyone who works with Bash scripts, if you add something to your Bash RC file, it doesn't automatically propagate through all of your open tabs. Now, for someone who has close to 9 to a decade of back-end experiences and spends more time in the terminal than he probably thinks he should, they'd already know that. But if you're fresh out of code school and you're just getting used to working in the terminal, this might be something that you would miss. So, adding a particular line of code to the Bash script and then telling them, okay, now you have to restart your Bash. That's something that's a gap that people writing docs might overlook. So, another idea. I'm not entirely in favor of this, especially if it becomes burdensome, but documentation is acceptance criteria. If you write it, if you create it, you got to document it. It's effective. However, it's if you're writing docs as an early step in the implementation process, maybe as an implementation plan, and then you revise it later on down the process. Documentation as an acceptance criteria. It's a good idea. All right, let's talk about AntiPatterns. What not to do. Don't do it. This in my mind, to me is unacceptable. If I was looking at new projects to get involved with, or projects to evaluate using, and I found out there was a GitHub repo with no README, I would just keep moving. I wouldn't even bother, even if it did everything. It was time to do everything I needed to do. No docs, later. So maybe the docs won't kill anyone or spill crude into the Gulf of Mexico, but maybe instead it's a missed half day chasing down a random error that turns out has already been solved and posted to Stack Overflow or something. BP didn't have a plan for the oil spill on the Deep Horizon, and that made it worse. So have docs, even if they're not real great. Making it wrong. Bad documentation is worse than, I would say, but than no documentation, as in having a bad map is worse than being lost. Quick fix, if the documentation is out of date, mark it as such. Mark it as out of date or faulty. All right, so doing it in half measures means they exist, not exhaustive documentation. That's troublesome. So you can go back to why it's hard to do documentation. So you don't make it easy to find is another one. If you bury your README should be at least one README should be in the root of a project, just because that's the first place you're going to look. Another one is violating Wheatons Law. For those unfamiliar with Will Wheaton, he was bullied on the internet in the early days, and so he, to quote him, the Wheatons Law is "don't be a dick." Simply follow these 15 easy steps, or follow the directions. This is a really big turnoff in a lot of for some people in communities when again you look at a particular problem and you think, oh, that's trivial, that's simple, But for someone who's coming at this project completely new, or even or even coding in general completely new, maybe they've never dealt with a package manager. So if you say, just run npm install, it's so simple. If you don't even know what npm is, you've basically just told that person, you aren't in the in group and you don't belong here, and you've excluded them. So people read the documentation because they're excited and they want to get involved. So you shouldn't kick them while they're trying to struggle. All right, no code is docs. It feels lazy. If I wanted to read the doc blocks on a project, I'd fire up Doxygen. There's a whole code project that all it does is it just takes the annotations in front of the functions and dumps them into an HTML file, and you can just read them, in a structured format. If I wanted to read the comments in code, I'd just do that. So, thank you, Edna. Code is documentation. So this is probably the most insidious, because it's an easy out. I mean, so often it's easy just to write a whole bunch of comments on your code and just be like, okay, well, I've written the code, I've documented it, I've written a whole bunch of comments on it. Well, if people are confused, they should just go read the code. That is assuming that they have a working knowledge of the components of the project. That means that they know, hey, if I need to go look at if I'm confused about this component of the page, I need to go over to this module here, which is never buried in a place you'd expect it, and go read the source code and parse out what the developer was thinking when they built it. That presupposes that knowledge of being able to pick out functionality and actually go find it in the code base. It's not empathetic to expect users to know how to parse comments and just automatically arrive at understanding. All right. So wrapping up, we write for humans. Being able to put yourself, that's the important part. We don't write for computers, we write for other people. Being able to put yourself in the shoes of another person and be able to see things in a way that they would see is crucial. There's a really great talk from a good friend of mine, Tim Cosgrove, called "Empathy for Idiots." And it's great because you're like, oh yeah, man, I want to have empathy for those idiots, and then you realize he's not talking about other people. Which the bad part about it for me was I didn't realize that until the second time I read through. I read through the presentation, and it was like, wow. Okay, so no, yeah, definitely Tim Cosgrove, "Empathy for Idiots." I think it's on SlideShare. He talks a lot about empathy being a key issue in how to put yourself in other people's shoes. Maintain the docs and make it fun. It's good for you, it's good for the team. Do more of it. Pitch it to your manager. Update as needed. If you're interested in talking more, here's basically almost every conceivable way of contacting me short of a carrier pigeon. Again, I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn, GitHub. I don't know if my Bitbucket account is public. And if you want, the link to these slides are posted at that bit.ly. And thank you.
Do you have time for
Yes, go ahead, go for it.
So how do you convince people, if you have a wiki, how do you build that kind of awareness and adoption so you don't run into the Slack thing every couple weeks of, hey, just check the wiki?
So Slack has pinned messages, so you can pin messages in Slack. That's one way. A lot of times, I will just spray links to it anywhere I can possibly think of. Again, you can do a here message saying, hey, there's a wiki page here. I think Slackbot can do custom call and response. So you could just be you just have a custom call and response for questions. So if someone has a question that you know is on the wiki, you could just hit that call and the Slackbot will drop back on you. A lot of listservs. At some point, I've noticed you get about 4 to 6 people working on a set of on a wiki or a set of documentation, and it just starts to take off in an organization from there, because at that point it's people are reading the documentation and editing it and revising it, so it gets better from there. So I would just send email would probably be the first step. Just put a link to the wiki everywhere you can possibly think of that people might want to go for it. So, other questions?
First, thank you for this is a great presentation in so many ways, and especially the GIF tool. Like, as I was like, there has to be an easier way to do this.
It's the most unfortunate name, and actually XKCD had a comic about that. Like, Licecap has the most unfortunate sounding name, but it is
and then my question, I guess, is a very Drupal specific one, and I'm just wondering about documentation for end users when we add like a new feature to a site.
Okay.
And we've been pretty keen on trying to work that into the website itself.
Yeah.
But we're really struggling with whether you could write help pages for a module and do it that way, which feels like the right thing to do. But the challenge that we're coming up against is that if you go to that help page as a site maintainer, you're seeing links to every single module that you have on your Drupal site. And so I don't know, it's just kind of a particular problem that we're trying to figure out the best way around it, and I don't know if you had that.
There's lots of different ways. We could probably talk about this, and I could probably talk. That's a whole half another talk about that. But one of the things I've really appreciated Drupal has something called the tour module, and you can there's a contrib module to extend and create your own tours, which uses something called the Joyride JavaScript library, which actually changes the viewport in the browser to actually put people through, and it's kind of like in-page documentation. I actually learned about it from WebChick here 4 years ago, and I was like, that's amazing, this is going to be so cool. So yeah, so tour or Joyride.
Install his module, web form, and look and see how he did it.
There we go.
It's the most amazing inline documentation, video, links to videos right in there, and we use that extensively on a platform that we support, and it comes in handy all the time and keeps support calls from happening on what would be a very complex module for normal users to understand, because there's a lot of config there. But Jacob does a great job of documenting his stuff, and so.
Okay, so I was not going to bring up web forms. The truth is, like, one thing I have found with Drupal's help system is it needs help to work properly. And I had to write a separate service to manage all the documentation as it's spitting it out to kind of get it better organized so that you don't have all these hooks everywhere and it's managed. But in core, there's an initiative, I think it's called Help Topics, and this is going to go into core at some point. It might take a few more releases. It's going to provide a UI to be managing the documentation in core, so you can go and tweak all the documentation in core as it's there. And it gets exported into YAML files. So, I mean, if you're going to try to do anything in core heavy documentation, that's the best place to start.
What was the name of that? Just to repeat that.
Help Topics. If you look up initiatives, it's Help Topics. It is, yeah.
Just for everyone at home, we're talking about the Help Topics initiative in Drupal, and how that'll work for. Okay, I'm not finding it, but yeah, I will tweet it out if I find it. So yeah, go ahead.
I came to Drupal from Symfony.
Uh-huh.
I mainly work with Symfony. Symfony is a PHP framework. Drupal 8 uses a lot of components from Symfony. And Symfony has a great documentation, an amazing documentation. Sometimes one thing that I miss in Drupal 8 is documentation like Symfony-wise.
Yeah.
The documentation in Symfony is a parallel project with the framework. So you have documentation for all the different versions. Right now there are like 4 versions of Symfony supported. And you have documentation for each of these versions of Symfony. The documentation is written in Markdown language, and from there, there's a GitHub repository for the documentation. You can collaborate with them. And from them, they map the markdown to the website or a PDF book. He's amazing. You should check him.
Yeah. Actually, at phase 2, I arranged to actually have the Symphony ebook hardbound and printed,
Yeah,
and then sent like 2 or 3 copies to the offices, just so everyone had. You could actually go to the bookshelf, grab a book on Symphony, and it was a 250-page document. So definitely +1 on the Symphony documentation. We had one more question. I think we have to take off here soon. Okay. Go ahead.
So the interplay between like what you say, oh, this needs 50 more steps, and you're like, I really should make the actual code product better. So any tips on sort of managing the interplay between writing documentation, realizing that the experience has to be better, and keeping like a virtuous feedback loop?
So the question was, how to, I guess the interplay between a complicated setup process or a multi-step setup process and improving the docs. If I had to pick one, if it was a burning building and I had to pick the dog or the kid, I would definitely probably go with let's simplify the setup process, because simplifying the setup process automatically simplifies the documentation process. So this is kind of we're getting back into the why documentation is kind of the second is a second thing people think about, is because documentation is written off of implementation, and if the implementation can be simplified, that automatically simplifies the documentation. So I feel people's pain when it's when documentation is super complicated and it's picking between one or the other. All right, I don't know when the next session starts, but I'm just guessing as soon as I can poke in here.
3:45, I think, is the
Thank
next
you.
one.
Thank you.
Thank you.